Ahoy there, sailor. With about 2 months of planning, a lot of expenditure, and a fair bit of issues regarding the van and transportation, we set off. Me and Jamie set off from Stirling, and having spent our first night there, then headed down south towards a place called Thorpe in Staffordshire.
People can always come and knock on our door and we're in the wrong place.
So, having spent the night in touristy Middle England in beautiful Staffordshire, me and Jamie then headed further south, past London to Kent, to a place called Dungeness, which is famous for two things: big shale beach and a nuclear power station. And it was fucking grim, very fucking grim, atmospheric and just grim. Fog everywhere, couldn't see shit. So as you can see, it wasn't really worth getting any footage from Dungeness. But then we headed to Dover, where we caught the ferry across the channel.
Doing a big old turny, bad boy.
Having arrived in the continent, in France, it was swelteringly hot, and we travelled down to the north of France into Belgium. We spent a night in Belgium in a place called Voswezel, which was really nondescript. There wasn't much going on there, just on the side of the road. And then we eventually met up in Germany in a town called Ratzeburg, which is just outside of Hamburg, with Nathaniel and Dave, who were other two members of the group for the trip. We had quite a bit of fun in Ratzeburg.
When I was 6, then you were 9. When I was darkness, you were sunshine. When you were shame, then I was pride. When you were Jekyll, then I was Hyde. When you were hope, then I was fear. When you were far gone, I was so near. When I was peace, then you were pain. I run away, you come again. Well, you never let go. Well, you never let go.
So with all four of us in the van, we set off after a day in Ratzeburg up towards Denmark, because obviously we're not too far from the Danish border, and we ended up staying a night in Odense, which is an island in part of the island chain of the Great Belt, which was quite nice.
Quiet farm living type of thing.
The next night was spent in Sweden, in a little place called Slicksy, which is just north of Gothenburg. It was rather beautiful, kind of lots of sort of sea lochs and fjords.
Oh, well, that's pretty sick, though.
View.
So then we were quickly sort of bombing our way north, and we made it to Norway, which was obviously our objective. We spent our first night in a place called Tofte, which is kind of I don't know how to put it, on the other side of the Oslo fjord to Oslo. And again, it was a really beautiful spot and cooked some super nice dinner that night. So our next night was spent in Lillehammer, which is obviously quite a famous place. It's where the Winter Olympics were held in 1994, I think. And we had to go and investigate, obviously, the big ski jump, which was pretty cool. So after Lillehammer, we continued north on the main road, I think is the E9, all the way up through the mountains, sort of central Norway, to a little village called Ellsberg, which was really pretty. We camped alongside the river, and it was very fast flowing and one of the coldest places we've ever swum.
Ready?
Yep.
Yes, lad.
So after spending a night in Ellsberg, we then headed north again on the E9 up to Trondheim, the city. We didn't spend much of our time looking around there, and we quickly headed across the fjord on the ferry to go and see Donald, Anna's brother, who had offered us to kind of stay with him for a little bit and see what he was up to. So that was cool. So having spent the evening with Donald, having a few beers and playing some Viking chess, which is kick-ass if you fancy it, we then decided in our wisdom that we were going to heck ourselves up north to Lofoten. So we bought a couple of cans of a drink called Battery, which is kind of like the most acidically horrible energy drink you can imagine, and just smashed it out, drove like 1,000 miles in 20 hours or so, and eventually ended up at a place called Narvik, which is another city on the coast, where we had a bit of a stoke around.
Do you want any food? Are you sure? Alright.
Enjoy.
You're not going to come choose, or should I just get you off?
So having thoroughly investigated the wreck of the German destroyer George Thiel, we then travelled into the Lofoten Isles themselves. Beautiful scenery, crazy sizable mountains. Spent a few days sort of camping around some of the towns there. And we ended up in a town called Svolvær, which is the capital of the Faroes. And there we discovered single-handedly the greatest item of the trip, a scooter, which was clapped as fuck. But it was the greatest scooter that we ever owned.
Big boy. Easy as pie.
You believe it's morning. I'm alive, but
that's the last thing on my mind. Do you believe it's morning? I'm alive, but that's the last thing on my mind.
Y'all see him in the street struggling, young, dumb, and thuggin', give a fuck about nothing. Stuck at rock bottom, trying to come up on something. Pumping from sundown to sun up, he hustling. Vision, my nigga, now get in where you fitting. And see prison as just a high cost of living, the life. Ante up, cause if you blow that dice on that OZ, Dorothy ain't going home tonight. That's on everything. Put it on the kids and the white. And bury in my clothes, ever since they raised the price on the coke. Searching for a quick antidote. More money, more problems to cope.
Chasing after the car.
You believe it's morning. I'm alive, but that's the last thing on my mind. You believe it's morning. I'm alive, but that's the last thing on my mind.
On rainy days I sit back and count ways on how to get rich. Coolin' with a mean, ill Jamaican bitch.
No way! Fucking sick, man.
Sweatpants style, Air Forces acting, jumping the 6 kicks, little Chris talking about the bird. Flow through your hood in the main tents, that's giant. It's like a family that flipped on you for lying. Buried you alive, left your whole crying. We on
This is for Sis's vlog.
Jesus Christ, they stink so. Sure, they didn't do it that many times.
That's how we.
Nah, I surely did it more than that. Actually, I don't know.
I can smell the grass one. Haunting me.
Don't even like licorice.
Who's he eating? Dad. Push it out.
But it took a while.
Yeah, it is. We can do it.
So unfortunately, it was now time for a huge trek back down the majority of Norway. So again, we bombed it as quickly as we could from Lofoten all the way down to a place near Trondheim where we spent a night, which was pretty grim. And then we ended up in a place called Farstad the next day, which is beside the Atlantic road, which is a beautiful stretch of coastal road that the Norwegians built, which is a bit nuts. So we decided to do some parkour.
2, 1.
Yeah. Oh. Oi.
So with some handy tips from Jimmy's uncle, who luckily lived in Bergen, we had a vague idea of what we wanted to do next, and we headed to Geiranger Fjord, which is one of the most famous and popular spots in the entire country, and it was pretty beautiful.
Hyggelig.
Send it, Jimmy!
That's so much
So having spent a few days in Naaman Karma, our next sort of step was along the narrow coastal roads that took us to a place called Oya, which was a beautiful little hamlet with this crazy hotel, which was filled with artifacts that you could go and have a look at from all of its famous guests. It was a pretty crazy setting. So having had a very bracing swim in Oya, we then travelled to another fjord called Flum, and we did the rational thing. We hired a pedalo and got very drunk.
You want the pooper scooper?
So after Oya, having had far too many beers and quite a bit of very rich food, we then made our way down to Bergen, which is a lovely city, and it's where Jamie's uncle lived, and he very, very kindly put us up, made us some great food, and we spent the evening there. And the next day, we set out on our way back towards Oslo on our return home.
Beautiful.
So Jamie's uncle had recommended that we visit this place called Langedrag, which was a wildlife park, kind of between Bergen and Oslo, and we had some pretty unique experiences there. Not myself, but the other guys decided they wanted to go and have a sit down with some wolves, which looked a bit sketchy.
What are you? Because they don't have the weird square things that goats have.
Yeah.
They've got those.
Learn them to act this way and to come while we're having some snacks. So they do. But they have this system and they are quite careful. So you can see his tail is quite low now in between his legs. So he's showing us respect. And his head is low too, and he's like worried. He's hearing and watching us with his eye.
So having spent 2 days in beautiful touristy Oslo, looking at museums and shops, etc., we then decided it was time for us to begin our long journey back home to Scotland. And on the day that we set off, shit began to go wrong. Just north of Gothenburg, the alternator belt on the van snapped. Well, it didn't so much snap as the belt just spun off, and we had to pull over to the side of the road, and we were stuck there for 3 days. Not a lot happened. It was pretty dull and pretty distressing, but we were very lucky in a way that we had a great gentleman who decided he wanted to help us out as a benefactor, which was pretty awesome. So big shout out to Will if he ever sees this.
Day 3 of the breakdown.
having spent 3 sweaty, miserable, hot days in a rather horrible suburb of Gothenburg, we then knew we needed to get a move on with the van moving again, thank goodness. So we headed down south with the remainder of Sweden, down through Denmark. We spent an evening in Germany outside Bremen, which was horrible, and eventually made it back to the Channel, where a game of blow football was held on the ferry.
Right. We'll get an ending. Mate. Right, you can start. Really. Oh no.
So with us all back on British soil, this is unfortunately where all the footage ends. We spent one evening in Dover. We got absolutely smashed in a Wetherspoons. We had no money, so thanks to all your beautiful donations that evening. Spent the night in a rather dodgy car park outside of a public park in the centre of the town, and then headed north the next day and spent the final night together in a little town called Uttoxeter, which is in Leicestershire, where we got yelled at by some people who we think thought we were gypsies. We caused a bit of a fracas in a small village because I think they were suspicious we might try and steal some of their possessions for some reason. But yeah, then after that, Jamie went south with his family for his family holiday in Stockholm, and the 3 others of us headed north again on our final trek homeward. But unfortunately, this is where the van ended, in a lay-by beside the M6 round about Stoke. The van overheated and the coolant was disgustingly dirty. We couldn't get it clean no matter how hard we tried, and unfortunately the van died that day, and all that was left to do was to gather everything together, get on a train and get home, which unfortunately felt like a bit of an anticlimax to the whole trip, and was rather unfortunate because we kind of hoped we'd still have a van to come home to, so to speak, especially after dragging it through all that time and money in Sweden. It was irritating to say the least that we had to say goodbye to it, but alas, there was no other option. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this rather protracted timeline of events of our wonderful excursion around Scandinavia from last summer, and thank you for watching.
I give thanks for being alive, cause I'm feeling alright. It's a present from above. Like I again, a better day I come. Thanks for being alive, cause I'm feeling alright. It's a blessing from above. Not crying. You know, easy walk, now easy talk, now easy enjoy down there. Stop for sick of them.